Good afternoon. At the moment, I see only myself, but not Professor Vincent Colapietro. He's coming. Here he is. Here we are both, one besides the other. We apologize for the delay, but now we are ready to speak about a very difficult topic: to change habits. Sloterdijk recently launched a book translated into English as "You Must Change Your Life." We are more polite. We put it in the form of a question. How do we change habits? But the presupposition of this question is the same. You cannot ask how you change habit if you are not convinced that you must change habits. And life is habits, isn't it?
It is.
Well, of course, the background of our dialogue is Peirce's conception of life, but perhaps not only. We are here to meet and to speak in a series of reflections. This is the second reflection. A week from now, we have a third. Last week, we had the first. They are all online, and you can access them without a minimum of delay. No further ado, Professor Vincent Colapietro, whom you must know by now, I believe, is ready to speak about this topic, and we thank him very much for being with us once more.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. The title of that book is actually a quotation from a line of poetry. And off the top of my head, I am not recalling the name of the poet. It might be Rilke.
Rilke, it is, yes.
You must change your life. Okay, so let's step back.
But it's from an elegy.
Yes.
Dueniza elegy. So
yes.
It's quite a modalization, if you know that this, not many people know that it is an elegy, but an elegy has a tragic note about it.
Right.
So, well.
Okay, so what I want to do is I want to begin by talking about habit change in a very general way, because it seems to me that the focus of our concern is really the deliberate alteration of habits. So when we as agents, who are oftentimes in some ways rather severely restricted by bad habits, want to change those habits. So somebody might want to quit smoking, or somebody might want to correct their posture. I do not sit properly, and it causes me backaches. So the focus on the deliberate alteration of habits is very, very important. But I want to step back and just talk about for a minute the habit change, the processes of habit change, and habits are changing all the time. And in fact, even when a habit remains the same, it is in some sense changing. I don't mean to be unduly paradoxical here. And all I mean by that is that when the exercise of a habit is fluid and unimpeded, what's happening in however imperceptible or slight a way is that the habit is strengthening. So in a sense, the habit's not remaining the same. It's getting stronger. Habits are either strengthening or weakening. They're never staying absolutely the same, no matter how much it might look like they're staying the same. So two other points about habit change in general is that habits change willy-nilly. They just change because of the spontaneity of firstness, among other things. So habit change is an inescapable fact about the natural world. The other thing is that habit change need not be a function of repetition. A single event might generate a deeply entrenched habit. Think here of a traumatic event. Think about a young child being attacked by a dog. And a single event, the attack of the dog on the child, might cause the child to have a lifelong fear of dogs. The child might be so traumatized that they unconsciously, automatically are fearful in the presence of dogs. So the formation of a habit might be generated by a single event. A traumatic event would be an example of that. Habits are always changing, even when they appear to remain the same. There is a very interesting anecdote that Peirce recalls, and I quote it in the at the beginning of chapter 5 in my book on Peirce's approach to the self. It's an anecdote that is an actual recollection of his from childhood. And it involves his younger brother, who was very, very young at the time. I'm not sure. I would say he was probably 6, 7, or 8 at the time. This is the brother Herbert, who went on to become a diplomat. He actually he was an ambassador in Norway, or Christiana, and the Peirce household was the center of not merely the scientific community, but the literary and the cultural community. And so it was one of the most important gathering places while Peirce was a young man, while Peirce was a youth, when he was not even a young man yet. It was a gathering place for poets and literary authors, as well as scientists. And one of the people who used to come to the Peirce household was the American poet Longfellow. And Longfellow's first wife was at dinner, and her dress caught on fire, and she was very severely burned, and she actually died as a result of her injuries. And this was a well-known incident around the circles in which Charles and Herbert and the other Peirce children. And there was a dinner party at the Peirce household. And lo and behold, one of the women at the dinner table's dress caught on fire. And Herbert moved immediately to the rescue, as though he'd been practicing this action. And he did it with tremendous speed and accuracy. And Charles was stunned. He said, afterwards, he said, "How'd you do that?" And the child effectively, his younger brother, effectively said, "Well, you know, I heard the story, and then I practiced in my imagination. I practiced in my imagination what I would do were such an event to occur in my presence." The point is that dramatic rehearsal of action in imagination, merely in imagination, can be the basis for the formation of a habit. So when the event took place, when the woman at the person's dinner table, dress caught on fire, Herbert's disposition was to respond immediately, as though he had physically, outwardly practiced saving a woman from such a disaster. And what he really had done is rehearsed it in his imagination. So this brings me, I think, to, in some sense, the heart of the story. For Peirce, rationality is, first and foremost, deliberative rationality. What makes us rational or reasonable is our capacity to deliberate, to think through alternative lines of conduct. And although the expression is Dewey's, John Dewey's, there is almost exactly the same expression in one of Peirce's unpublished manuscripts. And it's an expression used to define or at least characterize what deliberation is. Deliberation is the dramatic rehearsal in imagination of various scenarios. The dramatic rehearsal in imagination of the various scenarios. And you imagine you're going to do this, you imagine you're going to do that, and you try to, as best you can, think about the consequences. If you do this, consequences follow. If you do that, what consequences follow? Now, in sports today, and in sports psychology, there's this thing called imaging, that a player before a game will prepare for the game, oftentimes by imaging. They'll be thinking about their opponent's particular tendencies, and they'll rehearse in their imagination, that is, what their opponent's going to do and what they're going to do in response. And so what Peirce saw in the case of his brother is something which is really, it's actually part of common sense, but it's also very widespread in contemporary sports. We can also think about it in a social context. We can think about it that we're going to a meeting and there's a particular person who completely drives us crazy at this. We know this. They're rather officious. They're rather self-important, and they get and it causes one to lose one's temper. And one then prepares for this person being haughty and not losing one's temper. So what rationality at its heart is an exercise of self-control. It's an exercise of self-control that takes the form of a dramatic rehearsal in imagination, where we try out different lines of conduct and see what ensues from those lines of conduct. And so how can we change our habits? Deliberatively. That means imaginatively. Always, however, it's a goal directed, right? There is some goal or ideal governing the process of deliberation. Right? So one is animated by the ideal of not losing one's temper, becoming angry, and becoming one's worst self. And so you deliberate about what this person's going to do in this meeting, and you do so in light of the ideal of emotional self-control. You as an athlete, you're preparing against this opponent, and you know that this opponent has certain tendencies. Extremely quick, shows you the ball and takes it away. And if you go for the ball, he's going to go by you. And so you image the move, his one of his signature moves, that he puts the ball out just close enough. He baits you, he seduces you into going for it, and then he goes around you, and you deliberate, you image, and you say, "Don't take the fake. Don't take the fake." And so he puts the ball out, and you don't go for it, right? And each one of these examples then is predicated on the self-controlled agent, governed by a certain ideal, and also relying upon the capacity of imagination to help us dramatically anticipate consequences. So how can we change our habits? Not easily, not directly. Peirce is very close to Aristotle. There are at least three great philosophers. There's more than there are psychologists and all kinds of folks, anthropologists, who have written very insightfully about habits. But there are at least three of the greatest philosophers have made habit really quite central to their concern. And they would be Aristotle, Hegel, and Peirce. And just I'll be quiet in a second. Aristotle, even more than Peirce, supposes that we have extremely limited control over our habits. Peirce stresses how limited is our control over our habits and the alteration of those habits. Aristotle uses a rather remarkable metaphor here. He says the formation of a habit is originally in our power, but once the habit becomes deeply rooted in the character of the agent, that habit is almost virtually outside of the control. It's like, and he uses the metaphor, it's like throwing a stone. The initial movement and the initial action, the stone is in your hand, you throw it. But once the stone is out of your hand, you cannot call it back. The actions that generate habits are in your control. But once the habit is formed, Aristotle says, you have little or no control over it. Now, I think that's a little fatalistic, and it doesn't do justice. Doesn't do justice to other things Aristotle wrote. But the point is that just how severely limited it is, how severely limited our capacity to alter our habits is. And this is most evident when we're dealing with bad habits, smoking, or various kinds of habits, and we want to break those bad habits, and it's extremely hard to do so. And Peirce is deeply appreciative of just how hard it is to alter those habits. It's possible, but it requires the sustained exercise of deliberative imagination animated by some transformative ideal.
Mm-hmm. May I ask a question at this point? The problem may be in the question. How do we or can we change habits? If you ask how can we change habits, then you put the responsibility on the agent.
Right.
But if you ask how do we change habits, or how do habit changes occur, don't you have to put more emphasis on secondness, on interruption, on catastrophic events? And
Right.
here we come to the habits which are so dangerous in our present ecological crisis. What would you say about this influence on habits?
Right. No, I think that's a very important point, and not to needlessly complicate, but to complicate the issue. I think we have to bring in both firstness and secondness. Of course, we need to bring in all three of the categories, but for the moment, let's just limit our attention to firstness and secondness, because I think that what happens is a combination between rupture and spontaneity. So I'm trying to make this computer work, and I'm experiencing pure secondness. This thing, whatever I'm doing, it's not working. I'm bumping up against the wall, right? And what happens, it seems to me, in such cases, is that we become, at least I become, very quickly and intensely frustrated, and I don't have the presence of mind to conceive the full array or a wider array of possibilities. You kind of keep on doing the same thing and getting the same result, which is almost a definition of craziness or madness. So I think what happens in the best cases is that there's the rupture, there's the arrest of a habit, and then that opens a space for spontaneity. And so so we try this, we try that. The rupture, the arrest of the habit can optimally, does not always, does not necessarily, perhaps does not typically, but it can open up spaces of experimentation, possibilities we did not previously imagine or anticipate. So I think that the exercise of habit that leads to an impasse, we're stuck, can just be a frustrating experience, but it also can be the beginning of a learning. And so, and the learning involves then the explosion of a greater degree of spontaneity than was previously available to us. So yes. Just let me draw a parallel here. When Peirce is talking about evolution, he of course thinks there are three different types or forms of evolution, and he thinks Darwin only captures a dimension of evolution. And so chance variation, radical spontaneity is part of the explanation of evolutionary processes. And that's what Darwin focuses upon. And Darwin also focuses upon, in some sense, struggle, conflict. But that's not the whole of it. But those aspects of evolution run parallel to the processes of changing habits. So the agonistic dimension of conflict, the spontaneous dimension of chance, these are all part of the process.
Yes, but the third, you exclude the third now, the third principle of evolution. Isn't it important in this context too?
Right. Yes.
I took it for granted, I guess, but
I did. But why don't you say what's on your mind here? Because I do think it's important. But it ultimately culminates in agapistic evolution.
Right. So that's the third, isn't it? So could you say a word about this third possibility of evolution.
Right. So it seems to me that what Peirce has in mind, and he doesn't write extensively on this topic, and this is unfortunate. This is unfortunate because what he does write on this topic is deeply insightful. But what's crucial is that he's talking about a process of ongoing, more or less radical self-transformation, wherein the self in relationship to the other, in its relationship to the other, is being transformed in a rather dramatic, ongoing manner. And the way in which such self-transformation works is in part because of agape. Now, that means that I care for the other as though the other were myself. It is not, he's clear and it's subtle. He's not into self-abnegation. He's not into self-annihilation. The realization of the other and the realization of myself are in some complicated, not altogether obvious way connected. But this is a process of self-alteration, of self-overcoming, in which the dialectic or the relationship of self and other is at the center of that process. And it's precisely my ability to immerse myself in the other. So you as a linguist, transform yourself by immersing yourself in the study of this language and that language. It's precisely by your deep devotion to understanding this thing, which is not yours. And when you first come to it, it's quite foreign. When you're studying a foreign language, it's quite foreign. But it's precisely your immersion in that which is other than you that causes you to become transformed. Same, and it goes for all of the disciplines. And that really is an instance of agape.
Mm-hmm.
Solicitude for the other's sake, but not in such a way as to involve a negation of one's own self.
Mm-hmm. I have two questions. You returned to the self several times. So my question in this context, is the self a habit? The second question is, Peirce has an almost paradoxical expression. These are two very different questions, I think, of the habit of habit change. Can you answer these two questions, or do you have a clue to how we can overcome our perplexity with these two questions?
Yeah. So yeah. Well, I do not know that I can answer them, but I certainly think that I can make several steps towards addressing them. So I would hesitate and not say the self is a habit. I would say the self is an incredibly complex network of virtually countless habits that are more or less integrated. So the self is not a habit, but a network of habits. And it is not a fully integrated system or network. It's a more or less integrated system or network of habits. Peirce uses the expression, it's commonplace in the 19th century, that a human being is a bundle of habits. And that's important. But what it misses, of course, is the extent to which a person or a self is a unified or integrated bundle of habits. We're not just some random collection. We're not just some completely chaotic number of disparate tendencies and dispositions. We are more or less integrated. Now, what about us grounds or ensures, at least in a minimal way, the integration of our habits? And I think I don't want this to be construed as a dualism. I think that we simply, as organisms, in order to have the functional unity of a living organism, the habits of my being are more or less integrated. And if they're going off in all kinds of completely different directions, I will not survive. I could not live as such an organism. So what it seems to me is that we have at the biological or the organic level, a more or less integrated functional unity of habits. And then this organism acquires self-consciousness and acquires various reflexive capacities. Self-consciousness is obviously a reflexive capacity, but self-consciousness provides the basis for self-criticism. I'm aware of myself doing this, and I'm critical of myself doing that. And this self-criticism is not idle or purposeless, or it need not be idle or purposeless. It might have a point and purpose, and that point and purpose might be self-control. So I take this triad to be extremely important. So the human organism as a social actor acquires certain dispositions that cluster around these three capacities: the capacity for self-consciousness, the capacity for self-criticism, and the capacity for self-control. And the capacity for self-control ultimately makes a reference to some ideal. It could be a religious ideal, it could be a scientific ideal, it could be a moral ideal, it could be a purely cultural ideal. But this ideal allows me to integrate my habits more fully and finely than they would be in a purely random biological way. So to your first question, the self is not a habit, but a more or less integrated network of habits. As a purely biological being, that's one thing. On the basis of the functional unity of the living organism, however, we become self-conscious, self-critical, and self-controlling agents, and we do so in light of certain ideals to which we devote ourselves. Please, that's how I begin to address.
The second question was very different. The paradox of the habit change. Is it missing in some people who do not see the dangers of the future ahead?
Yes, yeah, I do think so. I've been reading a fair amount of Einstein. I'm teaching this semester, and Einstein has some wonderful short essays. And one of the things he stresses, and there are essays on a number of topics, and one of those topics is education. And what Einstein was not a very good student, as a matter of fact. He was a somewhat bad student in certain respects. But that caused him to reflect upon education in a really deep, thoughtful way. And one of the things that he keeps on stressing in these writings, especially on education, is that this childlike wonder is really crucial for the human animal, for the human learner. And one of the tragedies, and Freud says this too, one of the tragedies is how early and seemingly irreparably the childlike wonder of the human animal gets extinguished or gets maimed. And the most delightful and the most successful people, it seems to me, have ways of renewing and rekindling their childlike wonder. And others might it seems that something in their lives, and it probably has to do with fear, has to do with a deep kind of fear of change. Something, anyway, well, I don't know what the cause is necessarily, but something has extinguished or deeply maimed this capacity to wonder. So we constitutionally have the disposition to acquire dispositions, and optimally, the habit of habit change and habit alteration, that habit ideally grows. We in the course of our life become more able, optimally, ideally, to acquire habits. The record, the actual record, however, is rather disheartening, dispiriting, because you know the old adage: you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. And the point of the adage is that it's very hard as folks get older for them to acquire new habits. Some people I mean, if you think about artists, Picasso would be one, but Miles Davis would be another. They were always in search of trying to play in new ways. They were always breaking down the ways in which they performed their art and trying to become like children again and learning anew what it is to be a trumpet player or what it is to be a visual artist. So this capacity to reclaim our childhood, to be childlike but not to be childish, is absolutely crucial, and it has to do with the habit of habit taking.
Mm-hmm. The habit of habit change.
Yes.
Not habit taking.
Yeah, the habit of habit change. I'm sorry.
Yes. Well, I think we have touched quite a number of topics, and we should not stay among us two,
right,
in two-ness, as Peirce called it, and open the floor to questions. Luis Philippe will help us. Here we have the first. Which connection do you see about the topic and this pandemia crisis?
Yeah. Well, I see any number of connections. I do. I think the disposition to deny reality is a very deeply entrenched disposition in the human animal. So one of the things I see in this in the situation of the pandemic is the disposition toward denial, and that might even be constitutional in the human animal. But it seems to me that some people have the courage to confront the awful or the difficult, and other people tell themselves and tell others fairy tales. They're enamored of this. So it seems to me that there's an essential link between the search for truth and courage, and it goes to the very first thing you said, because most of us, some of the time, if not all of us, lack the courage to change our lives. Some people, all of the time, manifestly lack the courage to change their lives. So what would be the appropriate changes in the face of such a disaster, such an illness? It seems to me that we need to be both realistic and imaginative. And it's not enough simply to be realistic, and it's not enough to be imaginative. So I think we can tease out any number of connections, and I think it's a very, very important question. But not to be a Pollyanna, but it seems that the pandemic gives us the possibility of reimagining much of our lives. Reimagining work, reimagining school. So yes, it is awful. Yes, it is terrible. The number of deaths is just unconscionable, and those deaths are to a great extent on irresponsible and inattentive political leaders. Having said that, it's an awful situation, but what might we make of it? What good might we draw out of it? And among the possibilities, it seems to me, is reimagining work. It's perhaps time we did that. Mm-hmm. So I think I love the question. It requires a much fuller, more detailed, more nuanced answer than I can give now. But it's worthy of long, hard thought.
Yes. Are there other questions? Here is one. Alexandre Quaresma. The virus is on the frontier between the living and the non-living. Is he capable of semiosis? I should ask Alexandre, is he capable of semiosis? Why is the virus male? But this is a joke, of course.
Yeah. I take the pronoun to refer to virus. Okay, that's a good question. In our world, at least as far as we can ascertain, there are only fuzzy borders. There are no absolutely sharp lines of demarcation. So the living and the dead, the self and the other, culture and nature, at certain points, the borders between these are fuzzy. They're irreducibly fuzzy. And you can't say this is this and that is that. Anytime you have an exchange in which something on one side is transmitted or communicated to the other side, it seems to me you have an instance of semiosis. So in direct answer to the question, it's a very good question. In direct answer to the question, I would say yes. The virus, even if strictly speaking, the virus is not semiosis, although I'm not. I have to think about that. It lends itself to being described and explained in semiotic terms. And we would be at a disadvantage if we denied ourselves the semiotic terminology to describe and explain the kinds of interactions, transactions, and transmissions that are going across these fuzzy borders. So whether or not the virus, strictly speaking, is an instance of semiosis, what's going on needs, invites, and warrants being described and explained in semiotic terms.
Mm-hmm. Just as a parenthesis, we have on one of our blogs an interview with a biologist on entitled "Virus Semiosis."
Our friend from Estonia?
Pardon? Yes.
Yeah.
It's a bit selfish to recommend this, self-referential at least, because I'm involved in this dialogue. But it is not secret. So what are the other questions? Jeanne, how to change fake news sharing habits?
Well, this is a very difficult question, right? So I think that when we say fake news, we need, and I take the person posing the question to be using in this the expression in this way. When we talk about fake news, I mean, it seems to me that we need to be clear, and we're talking about fake news. All news is perspectival. All news is in certain respects biased. It's from a certain point of view. And if you read one paper, there might be a liberal bias, and there might be, when you read another paper, a conservative bias. Biases in and of themselves do not make news fake. Right? So fake news is a very different matter than simply biased news. And so while all news is biased, some is less biased than others. And the way in which it's less biased is precisely because the journalists are conscious of their biases and trying to counteract those biases. But the issue of fake news is an extremely difficult one, and it seems to me that what it's a failure. It's a failure of education and a failure more broadly of culture, that we have allowed something the folks just bombarding each other with manipulated images and shouting slogans at one another. We have allowed this to gain the degree of centrality and legitimacy that it has gained in our culture. It seems to me that is it possible? Is it conceivable? Is it imaginative? Is it imaginable to reform in a radical way a human discourse, human dialogue, where we address the other in a certain manner that displays my respect for the humanity and the otherness of that person. So it seems that we have our work cut out for us. And the only way of getting rid of fake news is by generating in an attractive way, using our media savvy, using our detailed knowledge of social psychology, and generating the conditions for a genuine dialogue. Mm-hmm. And that's long, patient, hard work. But nothing short of that is going to make a difference.
Yeah. Further questions? Gilma Hermes. Is it possible to talk about habits in social life in some phenomenological manifestation between firstness and secondness without self-control.
Thank you. I remember fondly your time here in Rhode Island. So I think it is. I think it's ultimately an incomplete discussion insofar as we do not bring in thirdness, but there might be very good methodological reasons not to bring in self-control or thirdness, because what happens too often is that we rush over the nuances and the details. And so if we talk about the habits of social life, and we might need to get down and dirty for a lot longer with the aspects of firstness and secondness, and not think of them so exclusively or even primarily in reference to self-control and thirdness. So I think that Peirce's suggestion about the qualities necessary for the phenomenologist, and the first one, he does this in the lectures on pragmatism, the 1903 lectures. And the first one he mentions is the capacity or the faculty of the artist to see what stares us in the face. We don't see. We see what is supposed to be there. We don't see what is phenomenologically there. And so precisely if we have an overriding concern with self-control and thirdness, we are altogether all too likely not to attend carefully enough to the wild, spontaneous ways in which social habits operate, and some of the hidden, imperceptible forms of conflict. So by all means, let's give these first two categories, these first two phenomenological categories, their full due. Now, ultimately, I think there has to be a reference to self-control, but methodologically, that might be suspended for a good long time.
Thank you. This is a complete answer, I guess. Further questions? Soraya. Juiz de Fora. New York is beautifully painted with the phrase, "Love is the answer." What changes or is changing in terms of habits for being with us?
Well, thank you for your question. So again, to go back to agape, and it might seem that I should have made more progress in my life by now, but I haven't. And so not merely to go back to agape, but also to go back to eros. So when the Greeks, the old adage or the old saying, the Greeks had a word for it, and their language could be their language is oftentimes richer than ours. So, and in particular, for example, philia, agape, and eros are three different words for love, and they might be not altogether different, or that is to say that they might not be altogether separable. So what's love got to do with it? In the final analysis and in the beginning, I'm disposed to say everything, because one of the principal reasons why we are so maimed as human beings is that we were not loved in the way we might have been loved well, according to our parents and others' best lights, their best intentions. But that doesn't mean that we're so complicated and delicate and multifaceted. Even the most loving parent might not have loved us in precisely the way we most needed to be loved. So in the beginning, if there's if love is inadequate, that has reverberations throughout a lifetime. And in the end, it seems to me that it's precisely my willingness to give up on absolutely brute force in the face of brute opposition and try to find a way in which I can recognize the humanity of the other, even when that being is acting in the most inhumane ways. In the immediate circumstance, I have to get out of it and defend myself, but I ought not to allow myself to form attitudes toward the other that are fundamentally predicated on the negation of the other. That somehow, some way, I need to reimagine the situation such that the other as human and the other as other comes rather clearly into focus.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do we have another question? Monica Allen. Wouldn't using rationality in changing habits in a rational way lead to hypocrisy? How differentiate the truth and the fake about the self in this context?
I don't know. That's a very good question, a very difficult question. So one of the problems is that the word rational is ambiguous. And I think there is a tendency, I don't know that we'd have to back and forth about the meaning of the words and the force of the question. But it seems to me that one of the tendencies we have is to equate logicality with rationality. And then also to think that each one of those is the equivalent of reasonable. And what I would argue is that there are actually distinct meanings here. So the rational is not simply a synonym for the logical. The rational is always more than merely logical. And as paradoxical as it might sound in English or in Portuguese or German, reasonable does not carry the same nuances and the same valences as rational. It's one thing to be rational, and it's another thing. It's at least slightly different. It's at least slightly different to be reasonable. So the notion that we can come up with a set of rules, as that we can identify an algorithm, in defining an algorithm as there being a finite set of explicit rules, or rules that might be made, are in principle able to be made explicit. It seems that is a commitment, a defining commitment of the rationalistic mind. And it might not be reasonable at all to suppose that an algorithm underlies everything. It may be that what there are flexible, fluid, integrated, nuanced habits that can in some sense be specified in the form of rules, that can in some ways be captured in the formula of algorithms, but the dictionary, the lexical definitions, the definitions in a dictionary, or the various words that any linguistic community uses, only captures part of those linguistic habits. The dictionary is an attempt to distill the essence of the habit. And the distillation is never complete, is never entirely. There's always more to the habit than gets down on the page. And so it's precisely in rationality. It's precisely the habits that are primordial, and the codes are secondary and derivative, and the algorithms are secondary and derivative, and it's precisely my dispositions which make me reasonable. So if somebody says something, let me stop myself. Person has a manuscript that's entitled Reason's Conscience. Reason's Conscience. And one of the things he implies, at least, is that unlike a moral conscience, a logical conscience issues in questions. A moral conscience will issue in negative and positive injunctions. Do not engage in acts of wanton cruelty directed towards sentient beings. So they're do's and don'ts. But what a logical or reasonable conscience does, the questions we ought to ask ourselves, if we are going to be in reasonable self-control of our thought, our feelings, and our actions. So it seems to me that the cultivation of reason is the cultivation of self-critical habits. Now, I don't see that as narrowly or mechanically logical. I see that as a kind of fluid, artistic sensitivity to what is the question. We're fixated on this question at this moment, but what's the question that the moment most calls for? In some sense, we imagine both too often that we know what the question is and we will know what the answer is. But part of the problem, it seems, is that we're not deeply Socratic enough. We're not really in possession yet of the question. What's going on? Yeah, we have some inklings, we have some intuitions, we have some intimations of what's going, but we do not know deeply, fully, finely enough what are the very questions we ought to be posing and addressing. So it's precisely that I take reason as the capacity to ask the question that we have not yet asked and to turn the whole discussion around in new directions. Just quickly, Wittgenstein has this wonderful analogy. We're trying to get out of a room, and an individual's in a room, and they're trying to get out, and the window's too high, and the door is locked. There's this, and all the person has to do is turn around and see there's a door that's open behind them. And so we have this feeling of being stuck so often, and we can't find our way out. But what might be required is metanoia, to have our minds, our souls turned around in a new direction. And then and only then will we find a way out. And then and only then will we find the questions we need to be posing.
Well, I believe this is a wonderful ending. There may be more questions, but at this point, I cannot imagine a better ending than the one of your previous remarks on habits and habit changes. And therefore, since we've already met for more than an hour, and the purpose of this meeting on reflections is not to extend the dialogue too long. I suggest that we think about your questions and the search for questions instead of answers. And nevertheless, I would like to give you the last word before, after I say once more, thank you for being with us and sharing your insights on this hot topic with us today.
Well, I want to say two things. I want to remind us of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. In particular, his advice where he says, do not try to answer the question. You are not yet in the position to answer the question. You must first live the question. And I think that's a very important piece of advice, not merely for an aspiring poet, but for all of us, that we have to have the patience, the humility, and the courage to live the questions of our time before we rather frantically and aggressively try to answer these questions. So the important thing before answering any question is to live it more fully than we have thus far. And the second word is one of gratitude. I love conversing with you. I love the way you conduct an interview. I always feel that I'm better than I usually am, always am, because of your questions. And I also must say, the questions from the group have been consistently of the highest quality, and so I'm very grateful to the members of the audience, all of them, for their attention, and for those who pose those wonderful questions. So I want to end with simply thank you. Obrigado.
Thank you once more, and thank you, Luis Philippe, for organizing our meeting. And let's thank Lucia Santella for organizing this series of reflections, which continues next week with a new topic that you all have found in the announcements. So thank you for today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Here they